It started with whispers, the kind that slip through break rooms and echo across factory floors when no one dares to speak too loud. The CEO of a powerful manufacturing empire was living like a king while his workers sweated through 12-hour shifts for pennies. Behind the polished glass of his office, he smiled for cameras and promised opportunity. But outside those walls, his empire ran on fear. Men were fired for asking questions. Mothers were punished for missing work to care for their sick children, and safety rules were ignored to save money. Everyone knew it, but no one had the courage to stand up. Until the motorcycles came. One morning, the hum of engines rolled through the city, deep, growling, and unrelenting. People stepped out of their homes to see a long line of black motorcycles heading straight toward the company's headquarters. The riders wore no masks, no signs, no slogans. Just leather, steel, and a purpose. They weren't there to protest. They were there to expose. Because one of their own, a quiet man who used to work inside that building, had been broken by the system that called itself success. And this time, silence wasn't an option. The CEO didn't take them seriously at first. He laughed, called them street rats, and told security to keep the gates closed. But when the club leader stepped off his bike and laid a small metal badge on the ground, a badge that once belonged to his brother, who had died after being overworked and denied medical help by the company, the air shifted. Cameras were already recording. Workers started gathering at the fence. The truth that had been buried for years was about to roar louder than any engine. Inside his glass fortress, the CEO began to feel the first crack in his untouchable image. He saw his employees looking up from their desks, whispering, watching the men who stood unafraid outside. Each motorcycle gleamed under the sun like a mirror, reflecting not rebellion, but justice. It wasn't chaos they brought, it was accountability, the kind that couldn't be bought or silenced with lawyers and press releases. That morning marked the beginning of something bigger than revenge. It was the rise of those who had been stepped on for too long. A story of power meeting truth, of arrogance colliding with loyalty, and of how a group of ordinary riders showed the world that real strength doesn't come from wealth or titles. It comes from standing up for what's right, even when your voice shakes and your hands are covered in the dust of hard work. And for the first time, the mighty CEO would learn what it feels like to face the sound of justice, one engine at a time. The CEO had always believed that fear was the key to control. He built his empire on intimidation, demanding perfection and punishing mistakes. Workers whispered his name like a curse, afraid even to make eye contact when he walked through the factory floor. He wore his wealth like armor, tailored suits, gold cufflinks, a watch worth more than the salary of 10 employees. But arrogance blinds even the clever, and he didn't see that his empire was already cracking from within. Beneath the silence, loyalty was shifting. The people he treated like machines were beginning to remember that they had voices. It started with small things, a missing report, a photo leaked online, a conversation recorded on a phone. One of the bikers, a former worker named Logan, had been inside those walls. He'd seen the truth, workers collapsing from exhaustion, supervisors covering up accidents, and the CEO laughing while signing off on layoffs that destroyed families. Logan hadn't said a word when they fired him. He simply went home, packed his tools, and called his brothers. The same men he'd ridden with years ago, the motorcycle club known for one thing, loyalty without fear. They didn't plan chaos. They planned truth. They knew the power of story, how a single image, a single confession, could do what lawyers and strikes never could. So they gathered evidence quietly, collecting testimonies from workers who had nothing left to lose. Videos, photos, bank records, proof that the man who preached about hard work and merit had built his fortune on exploitation. And when everything was ready, they didn't send it to the press. They rode straight to his doorstep. The CEO's first reaction was pride. He stood at the window of his tower, watching the motorcycles gather below, thinking it was some stunt, an act of rebellion he could crush with a single call. But as the engines roared, cameras turned toward his building. The world began to watch. And for the first time, he felt small. The very people he had silenced were now surrounded by those who had nothing to lose, men who didn't need money or approval to do what was right. By the time the sun began to rise behind the tower's glass, the bikers had set up screens, projecting footage for everyone to see. Workers stood frozen as their own stories, their pain, appeared in front of the building. It wasn't a riot. It was revelation. And as the CEO's face flickered across the glass walls, laughing, shouting, signing orders, the empire he had built on power began to crumble under the weight of truth. The footage spread like wildfire. Within hours, news crews arrived, drones hovered above, and the once proud company logo became a backdrop for shame. But the bikers didn't speak. Not yet. They let the images tell the story. They let the truth breathe. The workers, once terrified to raise their voices, now stood beside their bikes, watching as the world finally saw them, not as employees, but as people. Every frame was a wound reopened, but also a healing blow. Inside the building, the CEO's advisors panicked. They suggested statements, press releases, lawyers. But the CEO's hands were shaking. He wasn't afraid of the press. He was afraid of the people outside who refused to bow anymore. The ones who had seen him at his worst. The ones who no longer feared him. For the first time, his power meant nothing. His wealth couldn't silence what was already echoing through every corner of the internet. Then, through the sea of cameras and whispers, Logan stepped forward. The crowd went silent. He wasn't there for revenge. He wasn't even angry. He was calm, almost heartbreakingly so. He held a microphone, his voice carrying through the speakers with quiet conviction. "I used to work for this man," he began. "He said we were a family. But families don't break your hands and call it discipline. Families don't fire you for slowing down after 12 hours on your feet." His voice trembled, but it never faltered. He built an empire out of our pain. Today he gets to feel it. As Logan spoke, others joined him. A woman who had lost her husband in a factory accident the company had hidden. A father who'd been fired after speaking up about safety violations. Their words were raw, trembling, real. No script, no anger, just truth. And the truth hit harder than any riot could. People watching from home began flooding the company's pages with messages of outrage and support. The public no longer saw the CEO as powerful. They saw him for what he truly was. A man who forgot that power means nothing without humanity. Back inside, the CEO stood in front of the screen, his reflection merging with the faces of those he had wronged. His empire was collapsing not through sabotage, but through revelation. For the first time in his life, he couldn't hide behind status or numbers. The bikers had done what no union, no politician, no competitor had ever managed. They had made him look in the mirror and see what he had become. Not a leader, but the villain of his own story. The city hadn't seen anything like it. News stations broadcasted the images live, and social media platforms burned with outrage. Every post, every clip, every photo carried the same message. Justice was finally being served. But among the noise, there was something deeper, an awakening. Workers from other companies began stepping forward, sharing their own stories of abuse and greed. The bikers hadn't just exposed a man. They had started a movement. And at the center of it stood Logan, a symbol of quiet rebellion, a man who had turned pain into purpose. Meanwhile, inside the glass tower, the CEO sat alone in his office. His phone buzzed relentlessly, investors withdrawing, partners cutting ties, headlines calling him a tyrant. His empire, once worth millions, was unraveling faster than he could react. For the first time in decades, there was no one left to obey him, no assistant to shield him, no lawyer to rewrite the truth. The faces of his workers stared at him from every screen. They weren't numbers anymore. They were stories, stories he had buried to protect his ego. And now, they were his reckoning. Down below, the bikers waited. They didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. They knew real justice didn't come from humiliation. It came from accountability. Logan's eyes never left the glass tower. He knew the man inside wasn't just a symbol of greed, but of something far more dangerous, the belief that money could erase humanity. The crowd was restless, demanding the CEO come down and face the people himself. And when the doors finally opened, the city fell silent. The CEO stepped out, stripped of his arrogance. No suit, no tie, just a man, pale and exhausted, trying to hide behind sunglasses that couldn't mask the shame in his face. He scanned the crowd, then looked at Logan. "You think you've won," he said coldly. "You think you're heroes." But his words carried no power anymore. Logan stepped forward, his voice steady. "No, we're not heroes. We're reminders. You built a kingdom on the backs of men who believed in you, and you broke them. Today, they stand back up." A murmur rippled through the crowd, not of anger, but of unity. Cameras zoomed in on the CEO's trembling hands. The man who once silenced others now had no voice of his own. He turned away, retreating into the building as chants began to rise, not for vengeance, but for change. The bikers had made their point. The world had seen. And what came next would decide whether the lesson ended with one man or began with everyone. The following day, the CEO's downfall dominated every headline. Corporate tyrant exposed by motorcycle club, the papers read. But the real story wasn't about scandal. It was about transformation. Across the country, workers began forming alliances, speaking up for safer conditions, demanding fairness. The bikers had lit a spark, and that spark had turned into a wildfire of courage. But Logan and his brothers didn't disappear after the cameras left. They stayed. Because this wasn't about fame. It was about finishing what they started. When they returned to the factory gates a week later, the atmosphere had changed. The workers weren't afraid anymore. They looked at each other differently, not as survivors of oppression, but as partners in rebuilding. Logan walked through the gates that had once been locked against him, his boots echoing through the halls. Machines were still, but the silence was no longer heavy. It was the silence before rebirth. Inside the CEO's office, an interim board had taken over. They wanted to reopen under new leadership, one that valued humanity as much as productivity. Logan was invited to speak at the first meeting. Standing before the same executives who once looked down on him, he said only one thing: "You can't fix a system if you don't fix the heart behind it." And then he left, because some truths don't need repetition. They echo on their own. The CEO, meanwhile, vanished from the spotlight. Rumors spread that he sold everything, that he left the city, that he couldn't face what he'd become. But some said they saw him once, months later, a roadside diner. He was older, quieter, working as a volunteer mechanic for travelers who broke down on the highway. Whether it was guilt or redemption that drove him didn't matter. Maybe, for the first time, he was learning what it meant to serve instead of command. And as for the bikers, they never stopped riding. Their engines became the anthem of those who refused to stay silent. They weren't outlaws or heroes. They were the voice of the forgotten, the hands of the broken, and the reminder that true strength doesn't come from wealth or power. It comes from standing together when the world tells you to kneel. And somewhere along the road, in the reflection of a chrome mirror, Logan often thought of that glass tower and smiled, knowing that sometimes justice doesn't arrive in a courtroom. It arrives on two wheels. Months later, the factory that had once symbolized fear now pulsed with life. The walls were repainted, the machines repaired, and the people inside finally smiled when they worked. It wasn't perfect. No revolution ever is, but it was honest. Every paycheck came on time, every voice mattered, and every accident was met not with silence, but with care. For the first time in years, people walked through those gates with pride instead of dread. What the motorcycle club had done wasn't just justice. It was healing. They had given these people back their dignity. Logan often stopped by, not to oversee but to remember. He'd lean against his bike, watching the workers rebuild what greed had broken. A woman once approached him, the same widow who had lost her husband to the factory's negligence. She looked at him with tears in her eyes and said, "You didn't just save a company. You saved our faith in people." Logan didn't know what to say. He just nodded, his throat too tight for words. He knew the truth. It wasn't him alone. It was every soul that had dared to stand up. In the city beyond the factory, the echoes of that moment continued to spread. Other corporations began facing their own storms as employees spoke out, inspired by what the bikers had done. If they could do it, people said, so can we. A movement began to rise, not violent, not chaotic, but strong, grounded in truth and unity. Logan and his brothers became symbols of courage, but they never called themselves that. They were just men who couldn't look away anymore. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Logan rode back to the spot where it had all begun, the front of the factory gates. The air smelled of fuel and hope. He took off his helmet and looked at the rebuilt sign above the entrance. Where hands build, hearts matter. The workers had added it themselves. He smiled faintly, running his fingers over the engraved metal. Every letter felt alive, a promise, a warning, and a prayer all at once. For a long moment, Logan stood there, surrounded by the hum of life returning to a place once dead. The engines of his brothers roared behind him, steady as a heartbeat. And as he mounted his bike again, he whispered to the wind, "For the ones who couldn't speak, this was for you." Then he twisted the throttle, and the sound of justice thundered through the city once more. But the story didn't end with the CEO's fall or the factory's rebirth. Change has a way of testing those who demand it. As the movement grew, not everyone welcomed it. Wealthy elites, politicians, and competitors saw the bikers as a threat. Not because of violence, but because of truth. They launched smear campaigns, calling them criminals, extremists, troublemakers. Yet, every attempt to discredit them only made the people's faith stronger. The world had seen too much to go back to silence. The bikers never responded with anger. They didn't need to. They kept riding, kept helping, kept standing beside those who couldn't stand alone. In small towns, they delivered food to laid-off workers. In cities, they escorted whistleblowers to safety. Each act of kindness became another blow against corruption. They weren't an organization. They were a heartbeat that couldn't be silenced. And Logan, though still haunted by what he'd seen, carried that rhythm wherever he went. One night, as rain poured over the empty highway, Logan pulled into a roadside diner, the same one people said the CEO had been seen at months before. Inside, the smell of coffee and gasoline hung in the air. Behind the counter, a man with gray hair and tired eyes poured him a cup. Their gazes met, a flicker of recognition, then silence. It was him, the former CEO. No suit, no pride, just a man living quietly, finally free of his empire. For a long while, neither spoke. Then, the man said softly, "You were right to do what you did." Logan didn't reply. The man continued, "I thought power made me untouchable. Turns out, it just made me blind." He looked down, his hands trembling slightly. "I can't undo what I did, but I can spend what's left of my life fixing what I can." Logan studied him, searching for arrogance, but found only regret. "Then start small," he said finally. "Help someone. That's how it begins." As Logan left the diner, the rain eased, and the hum of his bike filled the night. He didn't know if the man would ever truly change, but for the first time, he didn't care about that. Some lessons take a lifetime to learn. And as the highway stretched endlessly ahead, Logan realized that justice wasn't about revenge, it was about balance. Sometimes, the loudest revolutions end not in noise, but in quiet redemption. Weeks turned into months, and the roar of the motorcycles became a familiar sound across cities and towns. Everywhere they went, people stopped what they were doing, not out of fear, but out of respect. The bikers had become a living reminder that courage doesn't need permission, and truth doesn't need title. Children waved as they passed. Workers raised their hands in silent salute. What had begun as an act of defiance had grown into something far greater, a movement of conscience. Logan, however, never saw himself as a leader. To him, he was just a man trying to make wrong things right. But the people saw more. They saw the way he listened when others spoke, how he stood up for those without a voice, and how he never let pride stain his purpose. Journalists called him the quiet storm, the man who led revolutions without shouting. And though the attention never sat comfortably with him, he knew one thing. The louder the world became, the more it needed silence that carried truth. One morning, Logan received a letter in the mail. No return address, just a simple envelope, weathered and handwritten. Inside was a photograph, an old man fixing a motorbike beside a diner, smiling faintly, grease on his hands. Attached was a note. "I took your advice. One repair at a time." Logan stared at it for a long while. He didn't need to ask who it was from. The former CEO had found his redemption not in apologies or headlines, but in work, honest, humble work. For the first time, Logan felt something unexpected, forgiveness. He tucked the photo into his jacket and rode out to meet the others. The road stretched endlessly before them, painted with dust and sunlight. As they rode through small towns, people gathered to greet them, not to cheer but to thank them. For every injustice they had exposed, They had planted seeds of hope. Farmers rebuilt cooperatives, teachers formed alliances, and communities began to remember what unity felt like. The bikers hadn't just changed a company. They had reignited a nation's faith in decency. At night, around their campfires, Logan often said little. He'd watch the flames dance, reflecting in the steel of their bikes, and think about how fragile power really was, how easily it crumbled when met with truth. "We didn't win," he once murmured to his brothers. "We just reminded the world what matters." The others nodded, their faces glowing in the firelight. And in that quiet circle of smoke and stars, they all understood. Sometimes the smallest group of men can change the course of the world, not with violence, but with conviction. The story of the bikers reached far beyond their city. Documentaries, books, and interviews tried to capture what they had done, but none could truly explain it. It wasn't rebellion. It was humanity rediscovered. Across borders, other groups began forming under the same idea. Loyalty to truth, protection of workers, resistance against exploitation. They didn't wear uniforms or follow leaders. Their only rule was simple. When you see wrong, do something right. Logan started visiting schools, quietly, without cameras. He'd sit with young students and tell them stories, not about glory, but about choices. He told them that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That kindness isn't weakness, and strength isn't measured by money or muscle, but by how much you can carry for others without expecting anything in return. The students listened, wide-eyed, as if hearing something the world had forgotten how to teach. Back at the old factory, life flourished. The company had become a model of fairness and transparency, now run by a cooperative of former workers. Every year, on the anniversary of the day the bikers rode in, the factory shut down for one day, not for mourning, but for gratitude. Families gathered, music played, and above the entrance hung a banner that read, "Truth rides on two wheels." It was both a promise and a reminder of the day the powerless stood tall. Sometimes, Logan parked his bike outside that gate and watched from afar. He never joined the celebrations, never took credit. He preferred to stay on the edge, where he could see the world without being seen by it. Watching those families laugh, those children play, he knew the mission had been worth every sacrifice. The scars on his hands, the sleepless nights, the battles fought, all of it had led to this. To something good, something that would outlive him. As the sun set behind the factory, Logan started his bike one more time. The engine's low growl echoed across the open fields. He didn't know where the road would take him next. Maybe to another city, another injustice, another broken promise that needed mending. But he did know this. As long as engines roared and people believed, no empire built on cruelty could ever stand forever. Because the truth, once awakened, never sleeps again. As time moved forward, the movement born from the bikers' courage took root in places no one expected. Factories, farms, offices, everywhere that people had once felt small, began to change. The sound of engines that once represented rebellion now symbolized accountability. Men and women who had once whispered about injustice now spoke openly. They didn't wait for heroes anymore. They became their own. Logan had sparked something that could no longer be owned or controlled. A consciousness, a pulse that kept beating through every person who'd ever been silenced. Still, fame was never what he wanted. He rode quieter roads now, far from the cameras, far from the noise. But every now and then, he'd stop at a gas station or diner. Someone would recognize him. They'd shake his hand and say, "You changed everything." He'd always answer the same way, "No, we did." Because he believed it to his core. Revolutions aren't born from one man's anger. They rise from 1,000 people's courage. He didn't see himself as a savior, just a reminder of what happens when good men stop turning away. In one small town, Logan met a young boy working in a local garage. The kid's hands were black with oil, but his smile was bright. "You're Logan, aren't you?" the boy asked shyly. "My dad said you're the reason he stood up to his boss." Logan chuckled softly. "Your dad's the reason your boss had to listen." The boy grinned, holding up a wrench almost too big for his hand. "I want to be like you someday." Logan paused, then placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "No, kid, be better than me." Build something no one will ever need to fix. That night, sitting beside his motorcycle under a blanket of stars, Logan thought about that boy. About all the people he'd met since the day they rode to that glass tower. Change was never easy, but it was possible. He'd seen men who were broken become builders again, women who'd been silenced become leaders, and even those who'd once done harm learn to rebuild their souls. The road was long, but it was no longer lonely. The world was changing, one honest act at a time. He lit a cigarette, the ember glowing against the darkness, and whispered to himself, "If the world forgets everything else, I hope it remembers this. Power means nothing if it costs your humanity." Then he looked at the endless stretch of highway ahead, the moonlight glinting off the chrome, and felt peace. Because no matter where he went, the roar of his engine would always carry a message the world needed to hear. Truth travels fast when driven by the brave. Years later, people would still tell the story of the day a motorcycle club exposed a corrupt CEO. But with time, it became something more than a headline. It became a legend, a symbol of awakening. Historians called it the day the engine spoke. It wasn't just about a company or a man. It was about every person who'd ever felt invisible. It was proof that even the smallest voice, when joined with others, could shake the walls of power. And long after the bikers had ridden into history, their message remained: truth doesn't die, it rides. The old factory had become a landmark. A mural covered its front wall, Logan's silhouette on his motorcycle, the engines of his brothers blazing behind him. But below it, in bold letters, read the real message: this is not where the story ends. Children who had never known what happened would point to it and ask their parents why it mattered. And every time, the answer would be the same: because one day, people remembered they deserved better. That simple truth became the heartbeat of a generation. Logan never returned for any ceremony or tribute. He didn't need to. He had become part of the road, the unseen wind that whispered through every revolution born in silence. Some said he was still out there, riding from town to town, helping where he could, never staying long enough for thanks. Others said he had finally found peace, settling somewhere quiet, his bike parked beneath a tree, rusting like a monument to everything he'd stood for. But whether he was gone or not didn't matter, because his story had already outlived him. In the end, the world didn't remember the CEO's name. His empire was sold, his wealth forgotten, his power erased. But the people, the ones who worked, fought, and stood tall, they endured. They carried forward what the bikers had started, the belief that no one is too small to make a difference, and no lie is too strong to last forever. The roar of engines had faded, but the echo remained, steady, defiant, eternal. And if you ever drive down a lonely highway at dawn, when the world is still half asleep and the wind hums softly against your window, you might just hear it, the distant sound of motorcycles on the horizon. Not loud, not angry, but free. A reminder that justice doesn't always come in suits or courts. Sometimes, it wears leather, rides chrome, and carries the heart of 1,000 voices demanding the same thing: truth. Years later, when the noise of headlines had faded and the dust of revolution had settled, people still whispered about the day the motorcycles came. It wasn't about revenge or rebellion anymore. It was about awakening. The story had become something larger than its heroes, larger than the factory, larger even than the injustice that started it. It had become proof that no empire built on fear can outlast the strength of those who stand together in truth. And as generations passed, the legend of those riders turned into a promise that whenever the powerful forget their humanity, someone, somewhere, will remind them. What began with engines roaring outside a glass tower ended with millions of hearts beating in unison. The bikers didn't just expose a man. They exposed a mindset, the dangerous illusion that success justifies cruelty. Their courage taught the world that silence can be broken without violence, that truth can travel faster than power, and that sometimes justice doesn't arrive in a courtroom, it rides in on two wheels. Their legacy lived not in monuments or awards, but in every worker who dared to speak, every leader who chose empathy over ego, every person who decided that decency was no longer optional. Logan's story became a symbol, not of heroism, but of humility. A reminder that change doesn't start with grand gestures. It starts with one person deciding that enough is enough. He never sought to be remembered, but in his silence, he taught louder than any speech could. He proved that you don't need wealth to be powerful or authority to be heard. You only need the courage to act when everyone else looks away. And that truth became the road others would travel long after his journey ended. Because in the end, this wasn't just a story about a motorcycle club or a fallen CEO. It was about every one of us, about the lines we cross for ambition and the lines we draw when we rediscover our conscience. It asked a question that still echoes today. When faced with injustice, will we stay quiet or will we ride toward the truth, no matter how rough the road? The answer, perhaps, is what defines who we truly are, not our wealth, not our title, but our willingness to do what's right when no one else will. So if this story moved you, if it reminded you that integrity still matters and courage still changes things, don't let it end here. Share it. Keep it alive. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell the world what you stand for. And if you believe that stories like this deserve to be told, subscribe and stay with us. Because somewhere, another voice is waiting to rise, another truth is waiting to be heard, and another engine, quiet, steady, unstoppable, is waiting to start.